Ohio House Speaker Matt Huffman, welcome back to Message from the House.
It's great to be back. I've not been here for a few months.
Did you have a nice summer?
Had a great summer. My wife and I did a great vacation driving out west, and lots of time with the grandkids in the backyard. So good summer.
Wonderful. We are back in full force, and we are here today to talk about redistricting, a big process you know a little about.
Yeah, I actually negotiated the Congressional Redistricting bill in 2011 when, at that time, I was the majority leader under Speaker Batchelder, and then with a number of other legislators, helped sponsor and campaign and pass the General Assembly reforms in 2015 and the congressional reforms in 2018, which solved all of these problems for all time. I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Before we got to 2021, and lots of lawsuits tried to blow all of that up, but didn't. So here we stand.
And so I appreciate you revealing your credentials to explain what redistricting is, and I think more importantly, explaining why Ohio is going through congressional redistricting this year.
Yeah, Ohio is a unique state because of, and specifically talking about congressional redistricting now. We have a unique system. No other state has that. Our process actually empowers the minority party, restricts the majority party in how they can draw their districts. This is why the reforms were so widely supported by voters. But one of the reforms was that if the parties don't agree, as in both the majority and minority parties at the beginning of the decade, the map only lasts for 4 years. And that's done really to put some incentive for both parties to agree to a deal. And because you don't know 4 years later who's going to be in power or exactly. So that uncertainty usually drives compromise and decisions. Now, that did not happen, and frankly, I don't blame it on the decision makers in Ohio. This was really largely driven by national people in 2021, both their litigation strategy and their ballot strategy. But again, here we sit because the Constitution requires us that if there's not an agreement at the beginning of the decade, that 4 years later, the process would start again.
And an interesting fact that I've learned from you and others in, working on this process is a deal was reached in 2011.
Well, a deal was reached in 2011 because the majority party, the Republican Party, passed a map. The Democratic Party threatened to referend it. They began gathering signatures. Now, at that point, the majority party can say, well, we can try to defeat that, or which means they won't be able to use the map. There's some uncertainty. So the majority party has a reason to negotiate. And in fact, we did negotiate. And what the Democrat Party came back to us in 2011 is that if we would draw a district on Lake Erie that would eliminate Dennis Kucinich but keep Marcy Kaptur, then we will provide the necessary votes to pass this as an emergency, eliminating the referendum. That district became known as the Snake on the Lake, and was a Democratic creation for the reason that I mentioned. Now, over the ensuing several years, that was blamed on me by Democrats, national mostly, and their political operatives in the media, which is kind of the way this story is being told over and over. But I think people that were there at the time will sort of nod their head and laugh and say, yeah, that was our idea, not Matt Huffman's.
Yeah, I think it shows that it is possible, and I want to roll into this misconception that the legislature has been behind in the process or has missed a deadline with September 30th now passing. Can you please clarify the timeline for folks?
Yeah, sure. So keep in mind that this, whether it's being done in a year ending in 1 or year ending in 5, at this point, 2025, there is, of course, an election year next year. And whether the primary is in May or as it is in 2026 or March, we need to draw districts so that the Secretary of State can have an election. And the idea is that can be done at any reasonable time for that to allow to happen. And in fact, in years past, often the map wasn't drawn until October or November or December. If you look back at 2011, it was very late in the process. We passed one map, then we repealed that map based on the agreement that I just described. And that was sometime in November-ish, but ultimately then that map was used and everybody agreed. Now, when you did the reforms in 2018, we wanted to give an opportunity for the parties to come together and work on this map and perhaps do that. But it couldn't last forever. So we said, look, if that hasn't happened by September 30th, then we're going to go to what we call, I guess, stage 2, the Redistricting Commission. So, the answer is there's not we had to do something by this deadline. There's an opportunity for it to be done this way if the parties could agree. And were the parties going to agree by September 30th in this case? I don't think so. And there's a couple of reasons not having anything to do with what either party may want. One was that there was really one of the reforms required that there be public hearings on these things. The map that was presented, I think, at a press conference by the Democrats was done before any public hearings and without any public input. That certainly flies in the face of what the reforms that we pass required. And, kind of when the stick was put in the ground that it's not going to be anything different than what we say, well, it looks like we're off to a bad start right away because clearly this anticipates some sort of conversation between the parties. So this is not a 30-day process or a 10-day process or anything like that. It's a process that we're going to try to get something done. But in the end, if we can't, the public deserves to have representatives in Congress, whether it goes in November. Now, the October part of this really just allows a different set of decision makers to perhaps come to an agreement. And it's a different process, it's a different vote, it's different considerations. And again, it's attempting to drive some sort of agreement on behalf of the parties. We'll see if it works.
I think you did a nice job differentiating between the Joint Committee on Congressional Redistricting, which just wrapped up, and the Ohio Redistricting Commission.
Yeah.
If you could quickly, is there anything else that would separate those two?
Well, yeah, the Redistricting Commission exists for a couple of reasons. One is it actually is the body that deals with the General Assembly districts, which we just voted on 2 years ago. And I know it was unanimous. Both Republicans and Democrats voted on that. I could ask anybody who's listening to this, tell me anywhere in the country that Republicans and Democrats agreed on a redistricting commission anywhere else in the United States. But we did in Ohio under the reforms that we passed on our General Assembly districts. So that body does that. But in essence, we reconvene those folks as part of congressional redistricting to say, if the legislature can't do this, perhaps you can. And so we bring those folks in. The joint committee that just met is required to hear any plans under congressional redistricting.
I need to ask the question that everybody has been asking the Republican Party. Where is the Republican map? Why has one not been introduced yet?
Well, I think if we're going to be true to what we said we were going to do in 2018, do what we said we were going to do, the one thing is we need to have public input. We need to have hearings where folks get to come in and say, here's what we think this map should look like. And, there's if you sit down and say, well, we want the Cleveland district to look like that, somebody's going to come trotting in and say, no, it ought to be like this instead of like that. And I understand that the National Democratic Party, which is largely driving this conversation for the local folks, and again, there are various political operatives in the media, only want to talk about partisanship. And that, of course, is talking about gerrymandering. That's drawing districts based on what it does to various parties, not taking into account all of the other demographic factors, the federal law, the local political subdivisions, all of the other things that we're supposed to do, is not what this reform was all about. So I think that we need to have some hearings, and we've had a couple of hearings already. We've had some people come in. That's why I was disappointed that my Democratic colleagues would introduce a map having no public input at all. We don't know what the source of that map was. So we want to have hearings. We want people to come in and talk to us about it. We opened the portal. We've invited people to send maps in. And so the reason, from my perspective, there's not a Republican map is because one hasn't been created, because we're asking people to tell us what you want. And most of the public is not interested in just a politically drawn map. And so we're trying to gather all of those factors. And at some point we'll have a map. Maybe the Redistricting Commission comes up with that. Maybe we do that in November.
Did Democrats come to any member of leadership, House, Senate, and talk with you all before introducing that map in early September?
I don't want to say strictly speaking, no, that didn't happen, because I've had a variety of conversations with Leader Isaacson about what the process would look like. He did call me the day, maybe the afternoon before, and say, we're introducing our map tomorrow. I didn't know that he meant he was having a press conference and presenting it, but I thought it was a bill, which in fact that happened. But no, there wasn't a here's what we think, what do you think moment of any kind like that.
So you believe the process in September shouldn't have widely been, here's our map, here's their map, let's have a bloodbath over it. September was meant for negotiations.
Yeah, well, that was part of it, was negotiations, but it was also meant for public input.
Yeah.
And making sure, we don't know, I think just recently we received the data for the Democratic map, and we're checking it out to see if it actually follows the dictates of the Constitution. By the way, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this. I understand that people are trying to win congressional seats and all of that, but keep in mind that Washington cares about total numbers of seats added up in Congress. A lot of us care about that, but we also care about our local congressional representatives. And is my congressman going to be, who represents somebody, say, in Mercer County, Ohio, going to be represented by somebody from Toledo, which is almost 100 miles away? How do I ever communicate with that person? How do we avoid snakes on the lake and things like that? And that's a lot what this does. So, I haven't looked at the Democrat map in detail. I did see that there was a district that started in Delaware County and went to Lawrence County. Those are the things that the reform was intended to prevent. Now, it's inevitable that there are going to be some districts that stretch across because we have wide expanses of rural areas. And that's why, the current map that we have, which the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, ultimately sent to the Ohio Supreme Court that said, we think it's constitutional based on North Carolina. That was the intent when they sent it back to the Ohio Supreme Court, I think. Although then the plaintiffs in that case dismissed it, so that could never be decided. But, what we tried to do is make sure that we limited those kinds of districts. And so, probably the first thing I would have said, knowing nothing else when I saw that map, is Delaware to Lawrence County is what we're trying to prevent from happening. But, be that as it may, we've got some time here to try to work out what the map will look like.
A lot of folks also ask, are you in favor of a 10-5 map, 15-0 map, XYZ, throwing out numbers? Talk me through why it's not as simple as throwing out a number or a percentage.
Well, again, we have in Ohio the strictest drawing requirements of any state in the union, and those were put in as part of it. The 2018 reforms hamstring somewhat the majority. It gives minority additional rights, and so you first have to do that. Of course, there's also other federal law that you have to follow and all of those sorts of things. So if you look, for example, at a map in the state of Illinois, you will see a district that starts in East St. Louis and kind of snakes, if I can use that term, all the way up through central Illinois, includes a couple of universities, and they call that a district. Well, that's clearly gerrymandering. You're not permitted to draw a district like that in Ohio. I would say, and you can say we have a compactness standard. What does compact mean? I would say that the map that was submitted by the Democrats in this case does not meet the compactness standard. And under, and again, we can all sort of say what's really compact and what isn't. But all of those other things need to be taken into consideration. The other thing, and I think this is probably the point that we all need to start being honest about here. There is no standard that requires that a certain percentage of districts be drawn based on some electoral wins or losses in congressional redistricting in Ohio. That does not exist. And by the way, it doesn't exist in any other state either. And that's why in many states, Republican or Democrat, but the ones I can think of in Democrat states, where Republicans in some cases do okay, even President Trump does okay, there are no Republican congressional representatives because there's no requirement in those states to do that. I mentioned Illinois. That's another, I guess I call it a bad example, but a clear example of that. And those, there is no requirement like that in the state of Ohio. So we began talking about this 10 years ago. And at that time, it was known as representational fairness because, here in Ohio, if we say it's fair and you attach that to whatever it is, fair funding formula for schools, fair districts, whatever, if it's fair, we're all for it. Well, in this situation, there is no requirement. But that has been a steady drumbeat since 2011 by the media. And you see that continue to be represented, and it has to be this, it has to be 8-7 because that's what it is, on and on and on and on. But there is no legal requirement of that. And there's also no legal requirement that we limit it to, someone mentioned the number of electoral victories Republican. There's no legal requirement for that either. I think that was the point that Co-Chair Timken was trying to make there is you could look at that. And I actually made that point a few years ago, and that's been somewhat twisted through the years by a number of people. But there is no requirement about percentages of votes or anything like that.
You mentioned Illinois.
Yeah.
The next question I have is about gerrymandering. We hear it thrown around a lot in this process. You've said it already in the podcast. You would think that it would be synonymous with Republican. It's not. I've been waiting to say
Why would
that.
you think that?
Can you tell that I've been waiting?
Because it's said over and over?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have the visuals for us to look at. And if you could just talk me through some of the examples.
Sure. Well, so this is the state of Maryland, the state of New Jersey. Now, the first, obviously, the diagram shows the amount. These are the numbers of votes, or percentage of votes that Donald Trump received in each of these in the most recent election, the 2024 election. So, in the Maryland example, I think they have 8 congressional representatives. 7 of those are Democrat. I think the Republican is from the Panhandle all the way out to the west. But they've been able to gerrymander their districts to make sure that more Democrats were elected. Now, I should also say, by the way, this is the number of percentage of votes that President Trump received. Other Republicans have done much better in Maryland. As of the end of 2022, at the end of 2022, they had a Republican governor, Larry Hogan. So there's actually Republicans winning statewide elections in Maryland. So if we were using this representational fairness or based on whatever percentage they get statewide, we should use it. Well, the state of Maryland should have, 34% or maybe 40% because I think if you look at other statewide candidates like Larry Hogan, they do a little bit better. But clearly, it should be 2 or 3 or perhaps 4 congressmen, if that was the process we're going to use. And I'll emphasize again, not to put too fine a point on it, that's not the process that Maryland's using, and it's not the process that's the law in the state of Ohio. So New Jersey, it's the same issue. President Trump did quite well there, and New Jersey is really trending as a Republican state. They're getting ready potentially in a few days to elect a Republican governor. But again, the Republican statewide showing, it's only half as much among Congress because, as you can see, they've done a good job of gerrymandering in New Jersey also. So do we have other ones underneath?
We do. I want to ask you, the parties not in power can't gerrymander. What would be your response to that? Well,
they have a better chance of affecting the map in Ohio than they do anywhere else. One, because of the restrictions that are put on the majority party about how we can't draw an East St. Louis like district in Ohio. Not permitted to do that by law. In most of the districts that are in Illinois, Chicago, places like that, that's not permitted under the law in the state of Ohio. Somebody asked me the other day about, well, what's fair? And my version of what's fair is everybody agrees to what the rules are, and the voters did that in 2018, and then we all make decisions based on what the rules are. Well, in Illinois, there are no rules. They just do what they want, and they end up with a situation, and again, Donald Trump got 43% of the vote. I don't know that they've elected a Republican governor in Illinois for a long time, but there probably should be 2 or 3 times as many Republican congressmen in Illinois. And, California is even though these numbers are the same, it's really more of an egregious example because of the number of congressmen that they have, something like 54 or 55. It's a lot of the U.S. Congress. California is about 1/6 of the population of the United States, so it's a big deal. And
keeps getting worse.
And so
by board.
I kind of chuckled a little bit when the governor said, well, if Texas does what they're going to do, then we're going to make up the gains. And I can assure you that Governor Newsom and other Democrats, whatever they could do to gerrymander the congressional map in California, they have already done. So it's a little bit of an idle threat, but we'll see what happens. So I guess the best examples we have are the great state of Connecticut and Massachusetts. And these are also states that from time to time will elect Republicans. I think Governor Weld a few years ago, there was also a Republican governor, maybe within the past 10 or 15 years in Massachusetts, but other Republicans. But we don't have 41% or 36% of the congressional delegation in these 2 states. I think there's 9 congressmen in Massachusetts. There should be 3 Republicans under the representational fairness theory. That doesn't happen. The other thing I will tell you is, we're using the votes that Donald Trump did pretty well, frankly, in these Democrat seats, but these also don't reflect the true Republican vote because of the way the presidential race is run. The Democrat doesn't go and campaign in Wyoming or Alabama, nor does the Republican campaign in Massachusetts and Connecticut. They're going to about the same 7 to 10 states. That's where all their resources at. If, in fact, Donald Trump and he's spent a lot of time in Massachusetts and spent money there, then Donald Trump would have gotten a higher percentage. Now, why would he campaign and go from 36 to 40 or 42%? He wouldn't. It doesn't affect the race. So, but the point is, clearly these folks are ignoring the very principle that Democrats are arguing we should follow in the state of Ohio, which is not in our Constitution. And by the way, they suggested all of that. When we negotiated this in 2018, we agreed not to put it in, and the voters overwhelmingly passed our reform.
So in synopsis, what do you think that this strongly emphasizes?
Well, I think, we can look at this, there's two ways to look at this. If we want to say nationwide, Congress should always reflect a percentage of the presidential vote. Well, that's kind of what Democrats are doing in their argument, but just for Ohio. But I don't think they should, because what that means is only the presidential vote counts. Mm-hmm. Only the votes of statewide officials account. And it ignores the very real consideration, important consideration, that local issues matter, that local candidates matter. Even though you're a Democrat in Toledo, Ohio, that doesn't mean you're have the same issues as a Democrat in Youngstown, Ohio. Republicans in Mercer County may not think the same things as a Republican in suburban Delaware County. And when you're always trying to reduce this down to simple math, you ignore what people care about. And what they care about, in my estimation, are the issues and the candidates. And certainly how much money you have and your political operation affect that. But there's a reason that Dan Troy continues to get overwhelmingly elected in a Republican district, and that Jim Thomas gets elected in a Republican in a Democrat district. They're both good candidates. They're smart. People like them. And, of course, the other part to that is that most Democrats do not identify as a Republican or a Democrat or any other party. They identify as independents. So it's a little bit of a slap in the face to say it's a Republican-Democrat issue. So, I think this issue it's not going to go away. But I know I'm repeating myself, but we have to get away from this notion that this is based on some sort of statewide vote. It's not, and nowhere in any other state is that true either.
For members of the public listening to this, what would you tell them as this process continues to move forward? We're hearing a lot of, we want to see the maps, fair maps. We hear a lot of anti-gerrymandering comments. What would you tell the public?
What I would tell the public is if you have an opinion about this, call your state legislator. And we can't, as we shouldn't on many issues that we have to deal with, we can't make our decision based on only the people who have the inside track at the State House. We're not just going to let the people who have a political machine, a media machine, who can afford to pay lawyers, pay lobbyists, pay political operatives to show up at the State House. It's more important for us to know, well, what do folks think in Lima, Ohio, and Marietta, in downtown Columbus, and how do we know that? They communicate with their state legislator. I've had a lot of people give me their opinions about this. I will also tell you that most of them, or many people, when you ask them about this, they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, look, I don't know anything about that, but I'm really, my real estate tax bill is out, or what are you going to do something about that? So is it an important issue? Yes, very important. There are a lot of issues that are more important. This, of course, gets more airtime than those because you have a national media machine that is put in place to try to help win Congress.
And for the record, for that national media machine, again, this is required by the Constitution in Ohio this year.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The someone asked me about what's going on in other states and what are they doing. It's interesting. In some of those states, the Constitution says, I think maybe in Kansas and one or two of the other ones, that the General Assembly shall draw congressional districts at least once per decade, which means they could draw it as often as they wanted to. But we're doing this because this is what our Constitution requires. And this could have been avoided 4 years ago if the Democrats would have voted on the map, which some have suggested they're now willing to vote yes for. But obviously things have changed with the decision the U.S. Supreme Court has made. But, as always, I'm willing to sit down and try to work something out with Democrats and with the people who are voting on this, which are the Democrat members of the legislature. And I don't think that someone suggested to me that all of the discussions that you have must be public. And I don't know exactly what that means. Like if Leader Isaacson comes over and says, "Can I talk to you about redistricting?" I'm supposed to say, "Well, before we do that, we have to call a hearing. Go ahead and ask me your question." And I think that's not realistic, and I think that's just something that people like to say to flail their arms around and get people upset. But, I'm optimistic, as I have been in the past, about getting these things done, and we have gotten them done. And except when national interests come in and start filing lawsuits, we're usually able to get these things resolved.
Speaker Matt Huffman, thank you so much.
Yeah, great talking to you about my 15-year voyage on redistricting.
It was very informational. 15 years and counting, right?
Well, I'm not going to be counting anymore after this,
Okay,
I hope, but we'll see.
That is fair. Quickly, our social media, Ohio House GOP Caucus on Facebook, Ohio House _GOP on Instagram, and OHR GOP Caucus on Twitter. You can subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. I asked if I had to continue to say that, and I was told yes. So
You said it really fast, and I'm sure that it means something to the folks wiser than I am, but you failed to mention MySpace again.
I don't know if we're on MySpace, sir.
Oh, well, you're missing out.
Do you have a YouTube account? I believe you asked me that.
Do I have a YouTube account?
Or know what YouTube is.
I know what YouTube is.
You asked me that earlier. Well,
Yeah.
that was our
I
only.
watch films of Larry Bird playing basketball on YouTube.
Oh, he's a legend.
Yeah, he is, Larry Legend.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, we'll end on a positive. Speaker Matt Huffman, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.